Senior White House correspondent Jackie Heinrich joins us now. Jackie, and by the way, we're watching the President of the United States walk up the stairs. We watched Vladimir Putin kind of limp his way up the stairs. So the President of the United States was deep in thought kind of at the podium. And he did say they've agreed on some things, but they didn't agree to have a major deal, and certainly not a ceasefire, Jackie. Have you able to ascertain what was agreed on and what wasn't?
No, unfortunately, I've been calling every source that I can and not getting much, if anything, out of them. I think that they want to let the president be the first to give his perspective on what we all witnessed, why things went the way that they did. I think we do need to hear from the president explaining why it was that he allowed Putin to come out and address the world, standing on a stage next to him without apparently having gotten what he said he would need for that moment to happen, which was enough of a negotiation, enough progress that perhaps they could get a second summit, keep the discussion going, bring Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, to the table. Now, for all we know, maybe that's in the works, and the president decided that it was probably better and more effective toward his ultimate goal of achieving a ceasefire and achieving a peace plan to allow this to go the way that it did. But in the room, it left us with a lot of questions, and the way that things panned out, having Putin take to the podium and lecture everybody about the root causes of the conflict and state that the Russian position is to ensure its own security when, of course, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. And a lot of the talking points that we hear from Russia in their justification of this war, to have Putin list off all of those things and then suggest that potentially any progress
Jackie,
made today
just real quick,
could be sabotaged by Ukraine.
Just a second. I just want to tell you on the other side, Vladimir Putin, who boarded his plane about 30 minutes ago, just left now. So he has left. He's heading back to Moscow. The President of the United States just walked up the steps, probably usually the last of his delegation, got out of the beast and walked up by himself. So he's about to leave. I just was texting back and forth with Sean Hannity, who just sat down with the president. And he said the president noted that he came out and said there wouldn't have been a war if he was president. And that's what part of Vladimir Putin said at the end of his written remarks. And he also said, on a scale of 1 to 10, I give today a 10. So that's the president grading what he thought of the meeting.
That's excellent news, and exactly what we needed to hear from the president, because obviously there's a reason why he allowed things to happen the way that they did. He allowed Putin to address the world here and take the stage, even if there were no questions asked by the press. There was a reason for that. We didn't get a lot of explanation in the moment as to why that happened, so I'm happy to hear that the president feels good about the progress that was made today. He did say that he needs to call Zelensky and call up NATO allies and give them sort of a readout of what happened. But also we should note that some of the agenda didn't go today the way that it was expected to. We know that the president was going to have a one-on-one with Putin. It turned into a 3-on-3 that included Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff. And then on the Russian side, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and also Yuri Ushakov, the one of the foreign ministers, or the, foreign policy advisors. So that happened, and then there was not the broader, expanded bilateral meeting that would have included the economic angle of this discussion with Secretary Bessent and Secretary Lutnick, Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, and also Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary. As far as we are aware, that broader meeting never came to pass because it was in the middle of that 3-on-3 that the press was called into their seats, and the two leaders came out and gave their relatively short summary of their meeting and then went on their way. So it's really going to come from the president and from the three people in that room to brief everyone else about where things stand, what's next, what he has in hand right now.
Jackie, thanks so much. I appreciate it. We're trying to put the pieces together little by little, and knowing the President of the United States, he's going to do a gaggle on that plane, and we'll get some answers right there.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.